Hi everyone and welcome to Module 2. I'm going to apologize in advance. I know this is a really important module, and so this lecture is going to be very long, so I apologize in advance. But it's a lot of really important information. So first off, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of special education. So it's been a long road. How do we get to where we are today? There's a lot of readings, YouTube videos and such in Module 2, and it's something that's really important that you take a look at. First off, it's important for us to understand both the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. In Module 1, we really kind of spent some time reviewing the Including Samuel module, kind of understanding and looking at the issues of disability awareness. So when we look at the history of disability, we, in the past, it was really the medical model of disability, which is up on the top here of this PowerPoint. And the medical model of disability essentially is that we're looking at the individual. There's a group of, a team that is working to work with that individual, but you're really looking to solve the problem. So you're looking at the disability as something that needs to be solved. Instead of just looking at the person as an individual. You're just looking at this problem, I gotta solve this problem, what's causing this disability, and what can we do about it. We've shifted now to the social model of disability. So now, you have the Americans with Disabilities Act, you have a lot of other laws and federal laws that are coming into play. And so now we sort of look at it with the social model, which is what are the barriers to that individual being able to do what they want to do. So instead of looking at it as a problem that needs to be solved, you're looking at it as like what barriers are there, what social barriers, what physical barriers, what is there that's getting in the way of that individual reaching their full potential. So this is a good way to look at it. So here's this person here trying to get up the stairs. Looking at it from a medical model, you're looking at the impairment as a problem. Like they should give that person a cure or prosthetics in order to make it up the stairs. Instead, we look at it as a social model, which is the stairs are the problem. They should be building a ramp, figuring out a way for that individual to be able to access that building, wherever that's going, just like everybody else. Here's another meme. I'm not disabled or differential abled or specifically abled or exceptionally abled. I'm an accountant in a wheelchair. So again, it's that equal access. It's not a problem to be solved. It's just that everybody learns differently. But that person is capable of just any other person to be an accountant. So back to the history of special education. There's a lot of information in the module. I'm not going to get into all of it today because we'd be here for a really long time. But I would urge you to take a look at some of the laws that I am proposing here and putting out here. So back in the 1800s and up until about the 1950s, really it was about attendance. So it's America's birthright to have education be available for everyone, but not for those with exceptionalities. So back then, if you had an exceptionality, if you had any sort of special education need, you were institutionalized, you didn't have access to the same educational rights as others. Then there's a ton of parent advocacy. Parent advocacy was very important. It still is very important, and it's actually, parent advocacy is what's, in many ways, enabled a lot of these civil rights movements and some of these other things that have enabled students with disabilities to have the same rights as others. So in the 1950s and 1960s, we saw the Brown versus Board of Education and some of these other cases, which really help set the stage for open the doors for students with exceptionalities. So we are essentially desegregating and providing those educational opportunities to everybody. So I urge you to take a look at the additional detail in the modules about all these cases, because they're all really, the ones that we mentioned in Module 2 are really important to understanding kind of where we are today. So the Education for All Handicap Act of 1975 was really instrumental. So that is now what's known as IDEA, or the Individuals with Education, Disabilities in Education Act. So this was signed into law in 1975, and like I said, before that, essentially students were excluded from school, and they were not receiving an appropriate education. So this law of 1975 essentially changed it all. So it provided federal funding for states to provide the special education services to students. So now students were no longer institutionalized. They were actually included and educated with their peers. This law mandates that qualified students should receive non-discriminatory testing, the least restrictive environment, so again, which is education with their typically developing peers. There were procedural safeguards for parents. Parents were involved in educational decisions, and these students should receive a free and appropriate education, which I'll talk a little bit more later, but essentially the same educational rights as all other students. So in 1990, IDEA was updated. They added some disability categories for autism and traumatic brain injury. They added provisions for things like transition planning, assistive technology, related services, and things like that. IDEA was again updated in 2004, which provided increased accountability, added some provisions for discipline, added some language in regards to identification of students with learning disabilities. It added some provisions also for highly qualified teachers and research for evidence-based practices. Another really important case to understand is the Raleigh case of 1982. So up until, we're going to talk about the Ed or F case in just a minute, because that was a recent case. But up until a few years ago, when parents and schools would have some sort of disagreement about how to educate a student who has a special need, the case law would go to this Raleigh case in 1982. So the important piece, I'm going to share these PowerPoints. I'm not going to go into all these details, but you'll have the details here. So essentially what the Raleigh case did for us is that the parents, the Raleighs, sued, saying that their student their child who was deaf did not receive a fair and appropriate education, free and appropriate education. So what happened is that the courts ruled with the school district, stating that, and it provided this basic floor of opportunity. So it essentially said that Amy Raleigh was provided an appropriate education. So the parents had gone in and said that they felt their daughter should receive a sign language interpreter for all the classes and things like that. But unfortunately, what the law, the case law had said is that Amy was making academic progress that was sufficient enough to be okay. So that's why they ruled with the school district. So it really was a basic floor. So the floor was really low, stating that as long as the student was making some progress, that was enough. So as special educators, it really made us think, well, gosh, it was subjective. What is enough, right? So, but that was in 1982. So that was the case that laid the groundwork for everything we were doing. But then in 2017, this was in Colorado, another family sued the school district, really looking at the same issue on what is a free and appropriate education? Really, what does that mean? Because like I said, it was very subjective. So anyway, there was back and forth with the different cases, with the different courts. But there was essentially this unanimous rejection of the de minimis standard. So essentially what the courts ruled was that the student needs to be making meaningful is important here, educational benefit. So it's still, again, it's very subjective because what does meaningful mean? But the way that most people interpret this to mean is that it's more than de minimis. So that you need to be making a significant academic achievement and academic progress. So it essentially ruled that their son Drew did not make measurable progress on the goals set in the past IEPs, and that the IEP did not address his escalating behavior problems. So this was really a win for special education. It set the bar higher. I would argue that it needs to be even higher than where it's at today based on this Ender F case, but this is really monumental to special education law. So now we're going to talk a little bit about special education procedures and services. So you can see here the different disability types that are in IDEA and the numbers of students who are served in each one of these categories based in 2015-16. So you can see that specific learning disabilities are one of the higher incidence disabilities, down with things like hearing impairment, which are pretty low incidence. Deaf blindness doesn't even show up on this list, which is what my kids have. So the Americans with Disabilities Education Act, which is what we were just talking about, that was first passed into law in 1975. The last addendum was in 2004. Has 4 parts to it. The first part is Part A, which is general provisions. So that's just terms, definitions, things like that. Part B is what we talk about that provides us guidance for students with disabilities for ages 3 to 21. Part C is for infants and toddlers with disabilities. So that's your Individual Family Services Act. So your IFSPs. And then Part D is talks about national activities to improve the education of children with disabilities. So that's going to have like these support programs, teacher preparation, professional development, things like that. So for the most part in this course, we're going to be focusing on Part B. So I mentioned it alluded to it a little bit earlier, but here there are 13 disability categories in IDEA. So it's still today, gifted and talented is not included in IDEA, and there's no specific category for ADHD. But other than that, you can see there's these other categories. There have been, like I mentioned a little bit earlier when I was talking about the IDEA, some of these categories were added over time. So like autism spectrum disorder was added after 1975, for instance. So when we talk about special education, we're talking about these specifically designed instruction that's in an IEP. But there's also related services. So related services, when you hear related services, you're talking about these developmental, supplemental services that students receive to benefit from special education. So those are things like speech and language, audiology services, interpreters, psychological, occupational, physical therapy. There's a list right there. So for instance, my children they have an IEP. They have specially designed instruction that has goals associated with it, but they also receive related services. So my kids, for instance, receive speech and language services, occupational physical therapy, audiology services, things like that. So there's 6 principles of IDEA. I'm going to talk about them briefly, but they're really, really important. So zero reject is that there's a requirement to locate, identify, and provide services to all students with disabilities. Not just some students, but all students. There's also protections for evaluation. So it needs to be, the assessment's going to be determined if is going to be conducted to determine if a student has a disability that's impacting their education. And we're going to talk a lot more about these assessments and evaluations and the rights associated with those a little bit later in this lecture. We talk a lot about one of the 6 principles is the free and appropriate public education, or FAPE is what we call it. So that is the right to develop and deliver an individualized education program for special education, so that a student can receive meaningful educational benefit. The next principle is least restrictive environment, or LRE is what you may have seen it as. So that's educating students with disabilities with their typically developing peers to the maximum extent appropriate. So that is the, when we talk about inclusion, we're talking about at least a restrictive environment. So a least restrictive environment, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but is going to be determined by each student. So each team is going to determine what the least restrictive environment is for that particular student, and it's going to look different for every student. Procedure safeguards, so those are the parent rights. So, if a parent disagrees with the IEP team, what rights do they have? We'll talk about that a little bit later too. There's also a principle of IDA, which is parent participation. It also talks a little bit about student participation, but parent participation. So again, that's where a lot of my research is focused on, but it's collaborating with parents in the delivery of their student or their child's special education program. So in that, it should be active involvement, active participation. So they should be problem solving. They should be an equal member of that IEP team. So I just mentioned least restrictive environment. So that is, educating students with disabilities with their typically development peers to the maximum extent appropriate. So it's really looking at, so when an IEP team is looking at a least restrictive environment, they're looking at, okay, how can we put that child in like an inclusive setting? So in a general education setting, what's going to be required in order to make that happen? Like what barriers are there to that student's success? How can we keep them there and only remove them when you can't provide that service in that classroom? So really there's a lot of research out there as far as how can we make this inclusive setting close to 100% of the time? What does that continuum of services need to be in order to ensure that that student has the same access to that education in that general education setting as their peers? So here's the continuum here. So on the left here is the general education class only. It goes all the way up to a residential school and a homebound instructor, a hospital setting. So you can see how there's this continuum here. And like I said, it's something that's going to be, it can change over time. It's something that that team is going to determine with the parent input on an individual basis. So a little bit more about procedural safeguards. So again, I talked about parents and students as an integral part of that special education process. And there's 4 components of these procedural safeguards. So there's general safeguards, rights to an independent educational evaluation. So if a family doesn't agree with the evaluation that the school provided, they have a right to pursue an independent evaluation of their child. They can appoint surrogate parents if that's appropriate, and they have rights to dispute resolution. So if they don't agree with findings of an IEP team, they have rights, like I said, some of those cases like the Andrew F., that due process right, those parents went and pursued due process in order to resolve a dispute. I will talk a little bit later about some of the other options that families have in addition to due process. So we talked about there's so many team members. So especially if there's complex needs that a student has. So I know for my kids, for instance, we have 10 different providers, team members. There's myself as a parent, general ed teacher, special education teacher. There might be paraprofessionals, someone who, if we're doing an evaluation, someone like the school psychologist who can evaluate and interpret those results. There might be outside agencies for transition services. For instance, my kids are deafblind, so a lot of times I'll bring in a deafblind agency as a team member. Not all the time, but sometimes I will. Administration for the local education agency, so somebody from the district will come to make sure that there's compliance. If there's related service providers, so for instance, my kids have orientation mobility specialist, teacher of the visually impaired, teacher of the deaf, all of these are related service providers. And anyone else who has knowledge about the student. So parents can invite advocates, parents can invite other family members, parents can invite doctors, any other consultants that they may have, anyone that they want to bring, they have the right to bring those to those team members to the meeting. And then, of course, I think this is the most important, is the student. So the IEP process. So first off, you're going to review the assessment. And after you review an assessment documentation, the team's going to develop a present level statement. So you're going to really set the groundwork. So what's the baseline? What is the student's current abilities? What are they able to do? What are their strengths? What are their needs? And so you're going to really create this baseline for the team. So after you do that, you're then going to develop this educational program that is specific to that student. You're going to develop these measurable goals, annual goals. And then once you develop those annual goals, and those are going to be SMART goals, we'll talk about that in a minute, you're then going to develop what that special education services plan is going to be for that student. So first you're going to have a baseline based on this evaluation. Then you're going to develop goals. Then you're going to figure out what the services are for special education services. You're going to figure out how you're going to monitor those goals. How are you going to report those goals, progress towards those goals to parents? How are you going to report that to the rest of the team? And then you're going to determine student placement. So this is really important. You're going to determine student placement after you're done with doing all those other steps. So you don't, a lot of times I hear from parents that a team will come in and say, okay, well, we're going to place this student in a self-contained classroom. And that's wrong. What first needs to happen is you need to start with the baseline. You need to create goals. Determine what the services need to be in order to meet those goals. Then you figure out placement. So placement always comes last. And again, it should always be, like I mentioned, that least restrictive environment. So you're really thinking about really how to best serve that student in an inclusive setting as best as you can with their typically developing peers. And then once you determine what this educational program is going to look like for a student, you're going to monitor that progress throughout the year. It's required that you have IEP meetings once a year. I would argue that it's good to have progress monitoring meetings and update meetings more than once a year. Anybody can call those meetings. So the educators can call those meetings, and also parents. So a lot of times I'll call and say, hey, it's been a while since we've talked. I really would like to go through our progress. And communicate that too, and make sure that students understand where they're at during the year too, so there's no surprises. So this is something that you may or may not have already heard. So we talked a lot about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, which provides us a law that covers the Individualized Education Plan, or an IEP, for a student. But there's also Section 504 plan, so that's a different federal law. So those are two different things that provide different supports to students. So you can see the differences here. So an IEP is going to provide specially designed instruction for a particular student, whereas a 504 plan is going to more talk about provide accommodations, modifications for a student who might have a disability. You can see that there's no age limit with the 504, whereas an IEP is only through age 21. An IEP is provided in the school setting, doesn't transfer to college, whereas a 504 plan will possibly transfer with a student to college. And discipline is going to differ as well. So we're not going to get into 504 plans a lot in this class. We're mostly focused on IEPs, but I think it's really important to understand that there is a difference, and just because a student has a disability doesn't necessarily mean they're going to qualify for an IEP. They may actually end up with a 504 plan. So there's many professionals that serve and work with students with disabilities, and we're going to talk a little bit about those. So first off, for special education teachers. Those are the teachers that are providing day-to-day services and instructions to students. Those roles are really going to vary, so by school, disability category, and many other things. We're going to talk about those varying roles in a couple slides. Some of the responsibilities that special educators have are teaching, reteaching, modifying that instruction, helping with accommodations. So a lot of accommodations. Accommodations are providing supports in order for students to be able to access the general education curriculum. Modifications, on the other hand, are adapting a curriculum in order for a student to be able, so taking it down to a different level so that the student can access it. Accommodations, an example of accommodation is extra time on tests, reducing homework load, things like that. Special educators are assessing progress, like we talked about. You're going to come up with those IEP goals and you're going to help assess the progress the student is making in those areas. You're going to consult and collaborate with other team members, and you're going to collaborate with bilingual early childhood and adaptive physical educators. Some other professionals that support students, the general education teacher. Again, we were talking about that least restrictive environment. So many times these students are being served in the general education classroom. So it's a lot of collaboration between the general and special educators in this entire team to be able to support the student. Paraeducators are often in the classroom, so they're key members as well. And then parents. There's also, like I talked about, many different related service providers that are listed on here that are also part of the team. And so there's a huge team that you need to be collaborating with. Here's another list of other professionals that are supporting students. Support personnel, like I know for my kids, even the recess teacher, for instance, is on that team. They know exactly what my kids' needs are. They know that they can pull a phone out to be able to change settings on their hearing devices, things like that. There's behavior intervention personnel, all different personnel that are helping with students. So I mentioned a minute ago about these changing roles. So there's so many different things that special educators are going to be asked to do. So you're going to, there's a variety of instructional methods. You're being asked to consult with different team members. You're co-teaching in the general education classroom with your general education peers. You're supervising paraeducators. There's a lot of paperwork. You're potentially being a case manager for IEPs, for instance. You're monitoring that progress. So you're figuring out the system in order to do that. Leadership responsibilities. So managing a team of people that are potentially working with the students. You're also involved, hopefully, in larger school initiatives, educating people on the needs of kids with disabilities. And you're also actively involved likely in the response to intervention or the MTSS process, which we'll talk a little bit in a minute. So a little bit about eligibility. So the first thing that's really important for us to understand about eligibility is that first, a student needs to be assessed and have a disability. So a lot of times a student, so for instance, my children, they were diagnosed by a medical professional to be deafblind. But you also need to prove that there's an impact to their education for them in order to receive an IEP. So it's not enough just to have a medical diagnosis. So a lot of families will come in and say, my child is diagnosed with ADHD, for instance, but unless they're being impacted in the classroom, they may not qualify for an IEP. And that's something that can be really frustrating for parents, and it's really misunderstood. But it's important that you understand that there's those two pieces. So you need to be diagnosed, but you also have it be impacted in the classroom. So referrals can work in many different ways. A lot of times, a parent can request an evaluation. A teacher can see something, a general education teacher can see something in the classroom and can request that a student be evaluated. So there's many different ways. The thing to note is that most individuals begin school unidentified. So oftentimes the first need is often identified by the general education teacher, and the general education teachers are supporting much of the beginning stages. So the referral process generally works like this. So first off, the team receives a student referral. So that can essentially, like I mentioned, come from a parent, the teacher, or something. So it comes to a referral team. That team decides if a special education assessment is needed. They seek parent permission to assess. So we talked about parent rights. You cannot assess a student for a disability without parent permission. It's absolutely critical. They receive informed consent from the parent to go ahead and proceed with that evaluation. And then the team conducts that assessment or that evaluation. And as part of that evaluation process, assessment process, the parent's input is critical. So special education assessments need to be, this is per IDEA, valid, non-discriminatory, reliable, administered by trained professionals, and sensitive to each student's needs. Here's several assessment components. You can look at vision and hearing, IQ, achievement, social and behavioral functioning, developmental history, and other areas. And so many times, like for instance, my kids have ADHD and deafblindness, so we did multiple different assessments. And sometimes you can reassess. If you see something else going on, you can do additional assessments later. So as far as eligibility goes, does the team believe the student has a disability? And this is what I was talking about. Does the disability adversely affect their educational performance? Would the student benefit from special education? So if you can't answer the first two as yes, then they likely are not going to qualify for an IEP. So what they're going to do is they're going to review the data, the individual student data, state qualifying criteria, and determine whether or not a student qualifies. They're also going to consider, are the difficulties that the student's having related to limited English proficiency? And they're going to be really careful about that. Or is it due to a lack of appropriate instruction? So they're really going to look deeply into really what's going on with that student to make sure you don't misdiagnose, overdiagnose students, and really get to the core of the issue. So response to intervention, RTI, is an alternative to address specific learning disabilities. It's nationally recognized, but it's not mandated. It's research-based intervention, data-driven. So what it is, the hope is to decrease special education and gen ed separation. So try to keep the students in the general education setting and provide interventions in that setting. The goal is to protect over-identification of students with exceptionalities. It's trying to avoid that wait-to-fail model. So like I talked about, in order to qualify for an IEP, you need to show that there's something going on and they're being impacted in the classroom. Well, in order for that to happen, a lot of times you have to wait for a student to fail. So a response to intervention program, RTI or MTSS, is going to help you be able to provide interventions to a student and document whether or not those interventions are working. So you can be doing something to help the students while you are still assessing them. It doesn't preclude them from being eligible for special education. So here's some RTI or MTSS has different tiers. So that first tier is the general education curriculum. So 80 to 90% of students are in that. So they're, and then you provide some supports to the student at that level. Then if they move, if they don't seem to be working and being successful in that tier, you can move them to a second tier, which is showing at risk. So these are students who receive or who need explicit instruction. So that might be something little that you might do. So 5 to 10% of students might require this more explicit instruction or some interventions in order to be able to access that general education classroom. So again, this is not special education. This is just students who need that additional support. And many times it's those English language learners who are also receiving these tier 1 supports. If that's not working, if those interventions are not being successful, then we will likely then move the student to a tier 3. So that's students who need more intensive instruction. So that's 1 to 5% of students. Those are students who would qualify for special education. Multi-tiered system of support, MTSS, is going to utilize those same principles of RTI, collaboration, school-wide involvement, really figuring out what should we try with this particular student, what interventions, in order to see whether or not they can be successful in the general education classroom. So those needs, MTSS is going to look beyond academics in order to do that as well. So here's here's something about like the different parts of academic RTI, and we're also, our MTSS is actually looking at positive behavior supports as well. So I'm not going to read this whole slide, but there's so much that goes into this. I suggest we're going to be looking at it a little more detail in a later module, but it's just something that I want you guys in this module to understand, that RTI and MTSS are something that's used in order to evaluate or assess the student for special education. So again, I think we already talked about this, but parent rights, testing, you need to be informed in writing, be culturally respectful of a family's needs, be full members of the team, and make sure that the student is being provided FAPE and LRE, notify parents of the evaluation changes, things like that, dispute resolution procedures, access to educational records. Parents have the right to all of those, and to be kept informed of progress and anything that goes on with their student. So I'm not going to get into it too much in EDSA 201, but parents, like I said, have rights. So if they don't agree with something that's going on with the educational team, they have rights. So mediation is one of those things. It's offered to parents free. So essentially, it's somebody that's going to come in and listen to both sides of the story and make a determination. It's an impartial party that comes in and meets with both members, the school district, and the parents to try to come up with an agreement. There are things that you can do. You can file, parents can also file a state complaint. Parents can also request a facilitated IEP. A facilitated IEP is recognized in many states. Colorado is one of them. So you can request that a facilitator comes in and essentially manages that IEP process, keeps everybody on track, keeps a parking lot, makes sure that there's if there's something that becomes, starts to become a dispute, that facilitator can help people move through those issues. There's also due process hearing. So we talked about that earlier. So that is likely, that's a long process. So due process hearing can take up to a couple years. It's very costly. It's more likely to be initiated by parents. It's a formal procedure. It's a formal court proceeding. It's very, very stressful. There's a hearing officer, like a judge, that proceeds. There's an appeal process that goes to different levels, state and federal levels. And like I said, it's really costly. It takes a very long time. And oftentimes it's just like a last resort that parents have. An IEP, what you need to know. So IEPs ensure that appropriate education is implemented to meet specialized needs of each student with a disability. So again, the I in IEP. So it's very, very individualized. It's about the student. The student needs to be involved in it at every step of the way. Here's the student's IEP team. There's all those different team members that are working with the student to determine how to best proceed and how to develop that IEP. We talked about some of the different parts of the IEP earlier in this lecture, and those are the team members that are going to help us get there. First, we're going to evaluate, then we're going to develop that IEP, and then we're going to figure out placement after that. Already talked about this, present levels of performance. So again, that's looking at the baseline, looking at those evaluation results, figuring out what information is necessary for that team in order to determine what the next step is. So looking at academic, social, behavior, communication, physical, vocational, looking at those test scores, grades, attendance, parent interviews, student interviews, and really looking at how the individual's disability is affecting their progress in the general education classroom. Those annual goals that I was mentioning, those are going to build accountability and documentation. They are required for areas that are impacted by the disability, that's specially designed instruction. And so what's that student going to accomplish in the next 12 months? How is that progress going to be evaluated? And it needs to be very specific. So if a student left your school, could someone else pick it up and be able to understand that goal and how to manage that progress? So again, those are going to be SMART goals, and I talk about that a lot more in EDSC 203, but are the goals specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely? So, that's really important, because if your goal is not specific enough or doesn't meet these guidelines, it's going to be really, really hard for you to figure out how to measure it. So as other part of an IEP is a description of the needed special education related services. So once you figure out what the goals are, how are you going to do that? So what specific special education services need to happen in order to meet those goals? How many minutes? What are the related services? So like, are there occupational therapy, an audiology? Do they need assistive technology? Things like that. What needs to happen in order to make those goals achievable? Least restrictive environment, we already talked about that. So how do we provide all those services in that least restrictive environment? So, in the general education classroom, how do you do that without removing the student out of that general education classroom? What accommodations and modifications are needed? So that extra time on tests, less homework, alternative assessments, things like that. And we're going to talk later about that later on in this module, or in this course. What are the service dates, begin dates, end dates, frequency, how often is the service going to be provided, where is it going to be provided, and for how long? How are we going to monitor progress? It's something that needs to be talked about by the IEP team. How are we going to inform parents of progress towards those goals? And this is the next couple things are not going to be required for every student, but if it's applicable, there would be a behavior intervention plan that would be included in the IEP. So if there's significant behaviors, that those should be included, and they must be included for a student that is qualifies for an IEP with an emotional disturbance. If a student is old enough, there will be a transition plan that's included as part of the IEP that would include specific measurable post-secondary goals. And the student is critical and needs to be, as per IDA is included, it needs to be included in that process. And at the age of majority, so when the student turns 18, that the rights of the parents are transferred to the student. And so that's going to, the students need to be informed of that before that happens. So I know that was a ton of information. I powered through that really, really fast. This is probably the biggest module. So please spend some time going through each one of the different pages in the module. And please reach out to me if you have any questions at all. It's really critical that that you guys get a good understanding of the history, the different components of the IEP, and the different roles of the different team members before we move on to the other modules. The next modules are going to be, we're going to talk about assessment a little bit more. We're going to talk about each one of the different disability categories in more detail so you get an understanding. But this module is actually setting the groundwork so that you understand special education. So if you have any questions, please reach out, and I hope you all have a great week. Thanks for hanging in there with me.